January 12, 1945. The snow fell in silence over Auschwitz-Birkenau, each flake dissolving against the frozen mud before it could settle. Obersturmführer Kurt Gerstein stood at the window of his office in Block 11, watching the smoke rise from the western crematoria. His reflection stared back at him from the glass hollow eyes, pressed uniform, the death's head insignia gleaming on his collar. 28 months he'd worn it. 28 months of madness dressed as duty. His hand trembled as he brought the cigarette to his lips. The tobacco was Turkish, a luxury requisitioned from the SS stores. It tasted like ash and guilt. Behind him, papers rustled on his desk. Transportation schedules, chemical requisition forms, the bureaucratic language of genocide, typed in triplicate. He'd signed them all. His signature appeared on documents that sent Zyklon B canisters rattling toward the camps on military trains, the same trains that brought the children. Always the children. Kurt crushed the cigarette in the tin ashtray and turned from the window. The office was sparse, a metal desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet bolted to the wall. On the desk sat a framed photograph. His wife Elfriede and their 3 children, taken before the war in the garden of their home in Munster. His daughter Adelheid smiled in the center, gap-toothed and innocent, holding a doll against her chest. She was 8 years old in that photograph. The same age as the girl he'd seen yesterday in the arrival yard. The girl had stood beside her mother on the selection platform, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her coat was too large, probably inherited from an older sibling. Brown eyes, dark hair matted with dirt from days in the cattle cars. When the SS doctor pointed left toward the gas chambers, the girl hadn't understood. She'd looked up at her mother with pure trust, believing somehow that adults knew what they were doing. That this place made sense. Kurt had watched from his position near the administrative building. He'd watched the mother kneel down and whisper something to her daughter. I watched them walk hand in hand toward the brick building with the sign that read, "Baths and Disinfection." Watched the door close behind them. 2 hours later, he'd signed the form confirming delivery of the Zyklon B. He sat down heavily in his chair and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, beneath a stack of blank requisition forms, lay a folded map of Switzerland and a forged travel permit he'd obtained through a contact in the Abwehr. The permit bore the seal of SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl and authorized the bearer to transport priority medical supplies to field hospitals along the Western Front. Medical supplies. The euphemism was almost funny. Kurt spread the map across his desk. The border crossing at Schaffhausen was marked in pencil. 160 kilometers from here. 2 days by truck if the roads were clear. The Allies were pushing hard. Now everyone knew the Reich was bleeding out. Soviet tanks had crossed into East Prussia. The Americans were at the Rhine. Orders were coming down from Berlin to accelerate the final solution before the camps could be liberated. Accelerate. As if it wasn't already hell made manifest. A knock rattled the door. "Herein," Kurt called, folding the map quickly and sliding it back into the drawer. The door opened. Hauptscharführer Otto Moll stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of coal smoke and something else, something chemical and sweet that Kurt had learned to recognize. Moll oversaw the crematorium operations. His boots were never quite clean. Obersturmführer. Moll's salute was perfunctory. The commandant wants confirmation on tomorrow's transport from Theresienstadt, 342. Mostly children from the family camp. Kurt kept his face neutral. How many cars? 6. Should arrive by 1400 hours. I'll have the requisition ready. Moll lingered in the doorway, studying Kurt with pale gray eyes. The man was an animal disguised in uniform, brutal, efficient, absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. He'd once told Kurt that the work they did here was necessary, cleansing, that future generations would thank them. You look tired, Obersturmführer, Moll said. Long night with the paperwork. The paperwork. Moll smiled thinly. Yes, we all have our burdens. He left without another word, pulling the door closed behind him. Kurt waited until the footsteps faded down the corridor. Then he opened the drawer again and stared at the map. 342 children. Tomorrow. Cattle cars packed so tight they could barely breathe. The journey from Theresienstadt took 12 hours. Some wouldn't survive the trip. Those were the lucky ones. He thought of his daughter Adelheid again. Thought of her gap-toothed smile, her trust in the world. What if she'd been born on the wrong side of Hitler's madness? What if it was her, boarding those trains? The answer settled over him like the snow outside his window. He couldn't save them all. But maybe, he could save some. Kurt pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. The idea had been growing in Kurt's mind for weeks, a seed of rebellion watered by every child's face he couldn't forget. But ideas meant nothing without action, and action required precision. One mistake would mean a bullet to the back of the head, or worse, assignment to a punishment battalion on the Eastern Front. He worked through the night, drafting and redrafting his plan by the light of a single desk lamp. The key was the transport itself. Tomorrow's shipment from Theresienstadt would arrive at the main platform. Standard procedure called for immediate processing, sorting the arrivals into those fit for labor and those destined for immediate liquidation. Children under 12 almost never passed selection. But between the arrival and the processing, there was a window. 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours, depending on how backed up the selection doctors were. During that window, the children would be held in a temporary holding area near the tracks, guards posted, but not heavily. Most of the SS focus would be on the selection platform itself. What if those children never made it to selection? Kurt stubbed out another cigarette and studied the camp layout he'd sketched on a piece of scrap paper. The holding area sat adjacent to the vehicle depot, where supply trucks were loaded and unloaded. If he could requisition a medical transport truck claim some emergency need for camp supplies to be moved, he could position it near the holding area during the chaos of arrival. But he'd need help. One man couldn't load 40 children into a truck without being noticed. He thought through the roster of personnel he interacted with regularly. Most were true believers like mole men who'd embraced the ideology with fervor. But there were others, men who'd been conscripted into the SS, who wore the uniform but kept their souls carefully hidden, men whose eyes still registered horror when they thought no one was watching. Kurt had noticed one such man 3 weeks ago, Rottenführer Franz Vogel, a driver assigned to the motor pool, young, maybe 23, with soft features that looked out of place beneath his field cap. Kurt had seen him vomit once after an action, bent over behind the garage, shaking. It was a risk. Vogel could report him, could be a plant by the Gestapo to root out dissent. But Kurt was done playing it safe. Playing it safe meant signing more death certificates for children. The motor pool sat at the southern edge of the camp, a cluster of garages and maintenance sheds, housing trucks, staff cars, and motorcycles. Kurt arrived at 0600 hours, before the first light crept over the eastern watchtowers. His breath misted in the frozen air. Franz Vogel was already there, checking the oil on a Mercedes transport truck. He straightened when he saw Kurt approach, wiping his hands on a rag. Obersturmführer. The salute was crisp, but his eyes were wary. At ease, Rottenführer. Kurt moved closer, lowering his voice. I need a truck. Tomorrow afternoon. 1400 hours. For what purpose, sir? Medical supply transport. Priority requisition. Franz glanced around the empty garage. Sir, I'd need authorization from... You'll have it. Kurt stepped closer still, close enough that Franz couldn't avoid his gaze. But I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands that not everything we do here is... right. The word hung between them like a grenade, with the pin pulled. Franz's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, what are you planning? To save 40 children from tomorrow's transport, get them across the Swiss border before they're processed. The rag fell from Franz's hand. That's treason, sir. That's execution. For both of us. I know. Then why? Franz's voice cracked. He looked away, toward the trucks lined up in neat rows. Why, tell me? Because 3 weeks ago I watched you throw up behind this garage after you drove a truckload of people to the gas chambers. Because I've seen your hands shake when you think no one's looking. Because I think you still have a soul left, Rottenfuhrer, and I'm betting my life that you do. Silence. The wind rattled the garage doors. Franz turned back to face him. His eyes were wet. My sister has 2 children, 4 and 6 years old. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see their faces in the arrivals. I see them on the platform. Kurt nodded slowly. Then help me make sure someone else's sister doesn't have to watch her children die. Franz wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What do you need me to do? The morning of January 13th dawned gray and bitter. Kurt had slept 2 hours, his dreams haunted by selections and smokestacks and children's faces dissolving like snow. He shaved carefully, dressed in his cleanest uniform, and pinned his medals with steady hands. If this was to be his last day wearing the uniform, he'd wear it properly. The camp stirred to life around him as he walked toward the administration building. Roll call sirens, barked commands, the shuffle of thousands of feet in wooden clogs moving toward the work details. The machinery of death grinding forward, relentless and routine. Kurt had prepared everything. The forged medical requisition form sat in his briefcase, countersigned with a passable imitation of the camp commandant's signature. He'd practiced it 50 times last night, until his hand cramped. The truck was fueled and ready. Franz waiting at the motor pool with engine manifests that would justify a departure during duty hours. The Swiss map was folded in his inner jacket pocket, along with enough landmarks to bribe border guards if necessary. All that remained was the transport itself. At 1300 hours, Kurt stood in his office window and watched the train pull into the arrival platform. 6 cattle cars, just as Moll had said. The brakes screamed as the train shuddered to a stop. SS guards moved into position along the platform, rifles unslung. The doors rolled open. They came out slowly, blinking against the daylight. Women clutching infants. Old men who could barely walk. And children. So many children, pouring out of the cars like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger and confusion. Kurt's stomach turned. He forced himself to watch. The selection began immediately. The SS doctor, a man named Kramer, who smiled while he worked, stood at the center of the platform, pointing left or right with his riding crop. Left meant immediate death. Right meant a few more weeks of labor before death caught up. But Kurt had noticed something during previous transports. The children were always moved to a separate holding area first, away from their parents, while the adults were processed. The SS preferred it that way, less resistance, less screaming. They'd lie to the mothers, tell them the children were being taken to a special barracks, that they'd be reunited after processing. The children would be held near the tracks for 90 minutes while the adults were sorted. 90 minutes. Kurt grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. The holding area was a fenced enclosure beside the platform, guarded by 2 conscript soldiers who looked barely older than the children they were watching. Inside, the children sat in clusters on the frozen ground, some crying, others silent with shock. A few still clutched belongings, dolls, books, a single shoe. Kurt approached the guards and pulled out his forged requisition form. "Orders from the medical office," he said crisply. 40 children are being transferred to the infirmary for typhus screening. Immediate priority. One of the guards frowned at the paper. "Sir, I wasn't informed. Do you want to explain to Sturmbannführer Hess why his medical screening was delayed?" Kurt's voice was ice. "There's a typhus outbreak in Block 7. Every child in this transport needs to be checked before they're integrated into the general population." The lie was smooth, practiced. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "I'll need to verify with—" "Then verify. But if children start dying from typhus because you delayed the quarantine protocol, I'll make sure the commandant knows whose fault it was." The threat worked. The guard stepped aside. Kurt entered the enclosure. 40 sets of eyes turned toward him, brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, all wide with fear. He'd planned to choose quickly, clinically, but looking at their faces, he realized he couldn't leave any of them behind. not if there was room. "Listen to me," he said in German, then repeated it in Yiddish, one of the few phrases he'd learned. "You're going to come with me, quickly and quietly, no talking, do exactly as I say." A girl near the front, maybe 10 years old, spoke up in accented German. "Are you taking us to our mothers?" Kurt's throat tightened. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." It was the only truth he could offer. He moved among them, selecting the smallest ones first. 40 children. He counted carefully, pointing as he went. They rose silently, some helping the younger ones to their feet. Their obedience was heartbreaking, conditioned by months in ghettos and camps to follow orders without question. Kurt led them toward the gate. The guards watched, but didn't interfere. Franz was waiting with the truck engine running. The canvas tarp was pulled back, revealing the empty cargo bed. He'd thrown blankets inside, and several canvas sacks that could hide the children if they needed to pass a checkpoint. "Quickly," Kurt whispered. "Inside. Under the blankets. No sounds." They climbed in with practiced efficiency, the older ones lifting the smaller ones up. Kurt's hands shook as he helped a tiny boy maybe 4 years old over the tailgate. The boy's fingers were ice cold. When the last child was inside, Kurt and Franz secured the tarp. "Drive carefully," Kurt told him. "No faster than normal. We're transporting medical supplies to the field hospital at Stuttgart. If anyone stops you, show them this." He handed Franz a second forged document. Franz's face was pale but determined. "Where will you be, sir?" "Right behind you in the staff car. If something goes wrong, keep driving. Don't stop for anything. Get them across the border." "And you?" "I'll buy you time." Franz nodded slowly. Then he climbed into the cab and pulled the door shut. Kurt watched the truck roll toward the main gate, carrying 40 stolen lives toward freedom. Then he walked calmly back to his office, sat down at his desk, and waited for the inevitable knock on his door. The knock came sooner than he expected. 15 minutes after the truck cleared the gate, Hauptscharführer Moll burst into Kurt's office without bothering to salute. His face was flushed with rage. "Where are they?" Kurt looked up from the paperwork on his desk, real paperwork this time, supply inventories he'd been genuinely completing. "Where are who, Hauptscharführer?" 40 children from the transport, gone. The guard said you took them for typhus screening." "That's correct." Kurt kept his voice level. "Medical protocol. There's been an outbreak in Block 7. "There is no outbreak in Block 7. Moll slammed his hand on the desk. "I checked with the infirmary. No one authorized any screening. Where are they?" Kurt stood slowly, meeting Moll's eyes. "I sent them to Stuttgart, to the field hospital. Standard quarantine procedure." "You're lying." "Careful, Hauptscharführer. That's quite an accusation against a superior officer." Moll's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "The commandant has been notified. He wants you in his office immediately. And he's ordered checkpoints established on all roads leading west." Kurt's heart hammered, but his face remained calm. "Then I'll explain the situation to him. Medical quarantine is taken seriously by Berlin. I'm sure he'll understand." But as he walked past Moll toward the door, he knew the game was over. He'd bought Franz in 45 minutes, maybe an hour if the checkpoints were slow to mobilize. It would have to be enough. Commandant Rudolf Hirsch sat behind his massive oak desk, like a judge at a tribunal. His uniform was immaculate, his face expressionless. 2 SS officers flanked him, security personnel with blank, brutal faces. Obersturmführer Gerstein. Hirsch's voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying. "You've presented me with quite the problem. Sir, if this is about the medical transport, don't insult my intelligence." Hirsch opened a folder on his desk. "I have reports from 3 guards confirming you removed children from the holding area under false pretenses. I have confirmation from the infirmary that no typhus outbreak exists. And I have word from the gate that you authorized a truck to leave camp carrying unmarked medical supplies." He closed the folder with a soft snap. "We both know what you've done. The only question is why." Kurt stood at attention, staring at the wall above Hess's head. He thought of the children in the truck, hopefully miles away by now. Thought of Franz driving carefully toward the Swiss border, thought of his own children in Munster, who would grow up without a father but might grow up in a world with fewer monsters. Because they were children, Kurt said quietly, because someone had to stop this. Stop this? Huss's laugh was cold. You think you've stopped anything? Those children will be found, brought back, and their deaths will be slower because of your actions. Maybe. Or maybe they'll make it across the border. Maybe they'll survive to tell the world what happened here. What we did. Huss stood slowly. You were a good officer, Gerstein. Efficient, smart. I trusted you with important work. But you let sentiment corrupt your duty. He nodded to the security officers. Take him to the execution yard. The world tilted. Hands grabbed Kurt's arms, dragging him toward the door. His mind raced not with fear for himself, but with calculation. How much time had passed? 70 minutes since the truck left. Maybe 80. Were they at the border yet? Had they made it? Please, God, let them make it. They marched him across the camp toward the execution yard, a small courtyard behind the punishment block where sentences were carried out quietly away from the main population. The wall was pockmarked with bullet holes. The ground was stained dark. Kurt was shoved against the wall. The firing squad assembled in front of him, 6 men with rifles, their faces hidden beneath helmet brims. Maul stood to one side, watching with satisfaction. Huss read the sentence from a piece of paper, his voice flat and bureaucratic. Treason, sabotage, aiding enemies of the Reich. Kurt barely heard it. He was thinking of the girl with the stuffed rabbit, thinking of his daughter Adelheid, thinking of 40 children whose names he didn't know, who might grow old enough to remember a Nazi officer who chose defiance over duty. Any last words? Hess asked. Kurt looked at him directly. History will remember you as a butcher. Me? They might remember me as a man who tried. Hess's face remained impassive. Fire. Franz Vogel pushed the truck hard through the January darkness, the engine whining as he took corners too fast. Behind him, beneath the canvas tarp, 40 children huddled in silence. They'd learned quickly not to make noise. The first checkpoint came 20 kilometers from the camp. Franz's hands shook on the steering wheel as he rolled to a stop. An SS sergeant peered into the cab, then walked around to inspect the back. Franz held out the forged documents Obersturmführer Gerstein had given him, medical supplies for the field hospital, priority shipment. The sergeant studied the papers, frowning. Franz's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Behind him, under the blankets, he knew the children were barely breathing. The sergeant handed back the papers. Proceed. Franz exhaled slowly and drove forward. 3 more checkpoints. 3 more inspections. Each time, the forged documents were held. Each time, no one looked beneath the blankets. By the time they reached the Swiss border at Schaffhausen, it was nearly midnight. Franz pulled the truck into a grove of trees half a kilometer from the crossing point and killed the engine. Silence. Then the rustle of blankets as small faces emerged into the moonlight. Are we safe? The 10-year-old girl asked in German. Her name was Rachel. He'd learned it during the drive. Almost, Franz whispered. But we have to walk from here, through the forest, quietly. They climbed out of the truck, one by one, stiff from hours of hiding. Franz counted them again, 40 children, cold and frightened but alive. Behind them, the truck sat empty. He considered destroying it, but there was no time. Instead, he led them through the trees toward the border. The Swiss guards were waiting at the crossing. Franz had been prepared to bribe them, to beg, to fight if necessary. But when he emerged from the tree line with 40 children at his back, the guards simply stared. They need asylum, Franz said in broken French. They're refugees. From Auschwitz. The senior guard, an older man with gray in his mustache, looked at the children for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Pass. Franz nearly collapsed with relief. The children crossed the border into Switzerland, into safety, into survival. He didn't cross with them. He stood at the border marker, watching them go. Rachel turned back once, meeting his eyes. She didn't say, "Thank you," there were no words big enough. Then she was gone, disappearing into the Swiss night with the others. Franz turned and walked back to the truck. He'd drive it into a river, burn his uniform, make his way to the American lines if he could. Obersturmführer Gerstein had given him a chance at redemption. He wouldn't waste it. Kurt Gerstein's real story remains one of World War II's most complicated legacies. An SS officer who witnessed the camps firsthand, he did attempt to expose the genocide, though the historical record suggests his efforts were less dramatic than this narrative portrays. He died in a French prison in 1945, his testimony instrumental in later war crimes trials, but his motives are still debated by historians. This story imagines what might have been if one man's defiance had saved lives instead of just documenting their deaths. Because sometimes the most important question isn't whether heroes existed in the darkest places, but whether we'd have had the courage to become one.